Hello everybody and welcome to Limited Level Ups. I'm Alex, and for this week's episode, we've got a tried and true level up episode. A little bit of evergreen content sprinkled in there as we wait for Dustmore to come out. It's a pretty big one too. Our topic today is Mulligans, and I've definitely covered Mulligans in certain capacities on the channel before, whether it be talking about Mulligans of a specific deck or a specific archetype, or, just a little segment in a gameplay level up episode, but never actually done a full dedicated level up episode. So some of what I talk about today is going to sound familiar to longtime listeners who might have heard me touch on Mulligans before, but I think it's a topic that really deserves to be revisited once in a while, because as the years of limited formats go by, things change a little bit. Going way back when to like the 90s, 2000s, games were way slower. The range of keepable hands was much wider. Today, 2024, obviously we know it's a very different limited landscape. You're under a lot of pressure a lot sooner. Games are much more defined by opening hands than they used to be. And I think even in the past 5 years or so, my takes have adjusted and updated just a little bit. Also, as is often the case when I'm planning out episodes and I go, we're kind of due for a level up episode, what should the topic be? I often pull from my recent coaching sessions and common mistakes or topics of conversation that come up there, and I'd say lately, at least once per session if we're focused on gameplay, Mulligans do come up. It's also a request I get a lot from the YouTube comments, so it seems like people want to talk about Mulligans, so let's jump into it. Alright, so often with level up episodes, I like to start from a place of just a bit of self-reflection and encouraging people to do a bit of thinking about their own tendencies as Magic players. I find that in a lot of content or just anywhere online that people talk about Magic strategy and sharing tips, people tend to be very broad with their takes. They'll say things like, people are underrating blue-black in this format, or people really overrate this card, or people don't play 18 lands as often as they should. And the issue there, of course, is it's like, what people? What people are you talking about? It's very broad. An individual person, you, the person listening, might play 18 lands exactly as often as you should. So that person's advice isn't going to apply to you. So asking yourself about your tendencies and how you currently view things, I think really helps to figure out if certain advice applies to you. So for today's episode, I think it's really useful to ask yourself, am I a player that mulligans too much? Or am I a player that doesn't mulligan enough? And luckily, if you have 17 lands, there's a very nice feature that just tells you that actually. All you have to do to find this is go to 17 lands, go to My Data, go to Player Behavior, and you'll get a nice little graph that it generates here for you for your mulligan rate. It also gives you a bunch of other metrics, by the way. Mulligan rate's the one we're going to focus on today, but it tells you if you're splashing too much, it tells you if you're not pivoting enough. But as you can see here, there's a little star with a little line graph here that'll say if you're mulliganing too much, not enough, or if you're in just the right spot. And luckily for me, for Bloomborough, it says you seem to be in the sweet spot, which is what you're aiming for. In this chart, for those curious what it's comparing it to players that are performing well. So it's saying you're mulliganing just the right amount, and what that's really saying is that people that win a lot in this format are mulliganing about the same rate as you are. I tend to check out my own player behavior once per format because you can filter by format, and different formats will have you wanting to mulligan a little bit less or a little bit more. So just something that's good to check in on. If you've never checked this out, definitely good, because again, it can really show you where your tendencies lie and lets you better understand where you should be moving towards. Okay, so let's jump into the nitty-gritty of it all. In no particular order, I'm just gonna rattle off some thoughts about mulligans in general. And first thing, I think what really informs a lot of my mulligan decisions is the idea that, at least my philosophy is, you should look for reasons to keep your hand rather than reasons to mulligan your hand. Generally, when people aren't mulliganing the right amount, they're over mulliganing rather than under mulliganing. And I think there's a lot of reasons you might over mulligan. The main one being that I think that the range of what counts as a keepable hand is likely larger than most people think. Like I was just mentioning, mulligans have popped up a lot in coaching sessions that I've had recently. And 9 times out of 10, it's not, ooh, you shouldn't have kept that hand, it's really risky. More often it's, oh, that's actually a perfectly acceptable hand. Sure, it's got a problem or two with it. It's not a perfect hand, but it's way better than going to 6 cards. And if there's something that I really want to impress upon you, it's that going to 6 cards is really bad. You take an automatic, 8 or 9% hit to your win rate. I don't remember the exact number, but I know there's been analysis done on that. And it's a really big number. You really do not want to mulligan if you can avoid it. And nobody likes to mulligan. Nobody's like, oh, great, I get to mulligan. Yeah, that's not the mindset, I know. But even still, I think people are just a little bit too willing to throw their hand back when their hand isn't perfect. when you're mulliganing or when you're deciding, should I keep this hand, you're looking for functionality. You're not looking for perfection. And I think especially if you're coming from constructed or have a constructed mindset, or I've heard some advice from people talking about mulligans that are mostly constructed players, you're going to hear things along the lines of, you know, be a responsible mulliganer and really don't be afraid to mulligan. And I think it's very true. You know, don't be afraid to mulligan. That's something that I would also say. But I think in constructed, you are often looking for a closer to perfect hand, not just a functional hand, not just lands and spells. And I'm not saying in limited you're just looking for lands and spells either, but I am saying that if you are thinking about mulliganing as a tool to be able to sculpt a perfect hand, like you're going, okay, I'm going to go to 6 because this hand doesn't have the perfect 2, 3, 4 curve out, or it doesn't perfectly line up with the plan for my deck, I think your framework for when you should mulligan is probably just a little bit off. I think another reason that people maybe mulligan too much, and this might be you, is maybe a fear of a fail case that the hand has, which, you know, might manifest in a way that looks like, you know, this is a 2-land hand, and, you know, I know I kept a 2-lander before, and I didn't draw my 3rd land, and I didn't get there, so maybe this is the kind of hand I'm supposed to throw back. Well, in that case specifically, I do think you're supposed to keep 2-land hands the majority of the time. I mean, there's certainly hands that have a bunch of, you know, 4s and 5s and just 2 lands, so, okay, throw those back. But if you're like 2 lands, and you've got a 2-drop, and maybe a few 3-drops, and you're like, ah, man, I don't know about this one. If I miss my 3rd land, it's going to be really bad. Again, don't let the fact that the hand has a fail case, has the potential to fail, make you mulligan it. Don't let the fear of not being able to play make you make a bad decision. You shouldn't really trust the vibes in that instinct. You should trust the numbers, the math that's actually going to check out, the math that tells you, hey, you're actually very likely to draw that 3rd land in the next few turns. And I've got an example hand here just to kind of illustrate the range of hands that I think is pretty keepable. So this is a Bloomborough hand, and the hand has Essence Channeler, which is the 1 and a white 2/1 rare that whenever you gain life, you put a counter on it, and it's got some other text too. Brightblade Stoat, the 1 and a white 2/2, first strike lifelink. You've got 2 planes, and you've got 3 black cards. You've got a Saver, a Fel, and a Starscape Cleric. The 2/1 can't block. Your opponent loses some life whenever you gain life. And this hand has a lot of uncastable cards, right? It's got 3 uncastables, but it also has 2 very good 2-drops. And I know a lot of people probably look at this hand and go, oh, yeah, just, you know, snap keep this hand. That's a very easy hand. But I also know there's a lot of people who go, man, I've got 3 uncastables. What if I never draw that black source? Again, the math, especially if you've got, you know, 8, 9 black sources in your deck, maybe you are a heavier black deck, you're 9 or 10 sources, this is definitely the kind of hand I would keep. And a big part of this, keeping this hand, is you've got 2 really, really good 2-drops, and especially 1 2-drop that gains you life. So you got a little bit of a life buffer if you don't draw that swamp in the next few turns. So as we go on here, I'm going to touch on some factors that push me to keep a kind of borderline hand, a hand that's not an obvious keep or an obvious small, because those are always the toughest ones, right? And we're always going to touch on things that vote against keeping a borderline hand. But to swing this back to my original point, this hand, while it does not have a black source in it, has a lot of things going for it. Mainly that it's got 2 very good and castable 2-drops, and also, if you do draw the swamp in this hand, your hand's just fantastic. It's so good. I think as humans, in a lot of ways, this seeps into us as Magic players, we do kind of think of, ooh, what if things go wrong for me, rather than weighing, oh, but what if things go right? Because yeah, sure, again, there is a risk here, there is a fail case, but you gotta weigh risk and reward at the same time. It's not just risk. You gotta think, yeah, if I do draw that swamp in this hand is phenomenal, and most opponents are just not gonna be able to contend with this hand. Up next, I want to talk about the idea that mulliganing well, or having the ability to mulligan well, starts with deck building. I think that in Magic, something that's very true is that poor decisions will often have ripple effects, and you can apply that idea to a lot of places, right? In game, you make one little mistake and that cascades into a bunch of other mistakes. But if you just think about drafting and deck building, you draft well, your build's going to be easier, and then the games are going to be easier. And I think this really applies to mulligans, because a well-built deck is going to mulligan way less often than a poorly built deck. And the 2 main things I think when I think poorly built deck needing to mulligan is having a bad curve and having a bad mana base. If your mana base is bad, you're playing 3 colors, you're playing 3 off-color basics, heck, 2 off-color basics, you're gonna have non-functional hands so much more often than a 2-color deck. You know, one thing that I say so much is just that 2-color mana bases, the classic 9/8, that's a bad mana base. Like the mana base that we are forced to work with a lot, the math doesn't check out, right? It's not in our favor. We're not like constructed players who have the luxury of having a bunch of dual lands in our deck to make sure we've got a good mix of both our colors. Our 9/8 mana base is just bad. So when you stretch that further, when you're putting a bunch of basics in, or you're splashing irresponsibly, your opening hands are going to be non-functional so often. So that's one thing, and I think a lot of people know, don't play 3 colors without fixing. But the other thing is just your curve. If you've got a lot of 2-drops, if you're prioritizing 2-drops, not only will you feel less pressure to need to mulligan because you're like, I don't have a 2-drop and I'm on the draw, and I know this is a pretty aggressive format, like a lot of formats are these days. If you just have 8, 9, 10 2-drops in your deck, which is hard to get to sometimes, but if you're approaching that number, your opening hand is going to have a 2-drop way more often than not. And let's say you don't have a 2-drop in your opening hand, but you've got 8 or 9 of them in your deck, I still feel pretty confident about keeping that hand because I'm pretty likely to see a 2-drop in my next 2 draws before I need to actually play a 2-drop. Another thing that I've noticed happens sometimes is people will draw their opening hand and not have a 2-drop, but their deck only has like 3 or 4 2-drops, like they just didn't prioritize them where they should have in the draft basically, so they didn't end up with enough. And, maybe it is a faster format, and they draw their opening hand, and they have no 2-drop, and they go, okay, I should mulligan this hand because I need a 2-drop. Well, the problem there is if your deck doesn't have that many 2-drops, it's just not that likely that your 6-card hand will have a 2-drop either, right? So you're kind of going down to 6 cards for a very small chance of actually finding what you need, which I don't think is great. So if you do end up in that spot where you don't have a lot of 2s, a lot of times you just have to keep that 7-card hand because your 6-card hand isn't that much more likely to be better. So yeah, I think it can be really easy to, once you jump into the games, just forget about how your draft went and how your deck build went and just go, okay, well, let me look at the hand that the game has given me. Nope, that's a mulligan. Nope, that's a mulligan. And you might just feel like you're mulliganing a lot. And I think that chart that I looked at on 17 lands, there's a lot of confounding factors there. I'm sure that people that do mulligan too often probably have some building and deck building issues in general, right? They probably mulligan too often, not just because they think the range of keepable hands is smaller than it actually is, but probably because they have hands and they have decks that are just like, yeah, you actually cannot keep this hand. It's a non-functional hand. Can't cast your spells. Don't have enough cheap cards. So this is, like I often advocate for, good mana and good curve. I'm sure if you've listened to my content before, you don't need to hear that again from me. That's something that I say a lot. But being responsible with your mana and having a good curve makes your mulligan so much easier. All right, let's talk about some math. I know maybe a little bit dry for some, but when it comes to mulliganing, knowing your math, I think, is actually really important, or I guess knowing what math to use. And the main reason that I think math is important is when I'm determining if my hand is keepable, I'm looking at 7 cards, yeah, but I'm really looking at like 9 cards, except 2 of them are hidden, which is to say that the opening hand and when your hand is actually going to need to be functional is about by turn 2, right? After you've drawn 2 cards, or, if play or draw, it depends, right? If you're on the draw, you're going to draw 2. If you're on the play, you're going to have drawn 1 additional card. But point being that your opening hand isn't all you have to work with. Really, it's your opening hand and the next few cards in your library. And you're not trying to tell the future exactly, but some math can help you. It can tell you the odds of hitting what you need to hit to make the hand functional. Again, this touches on the idea that I think there's a lot of hands out there that are more keepable than the average player might deem to be keepable because they're not considering those next 2 mystery cards. So if you have a hand and you go, man, this hand just needs one little thing, like it needs a swamp to be functional, or it needs one more land to be functional. What do you do to figure that out? Well, let's take our hand that we looked at a few minutes ago, the hand that has the Essence Channeler and the Brightblade Stout, 2 plains and 3 black cards. Let's change this hand a little bit. Let's take out the Essence Channeler and let's add a Saver. So now we're looking at 4 black cards, 2 plains, and a Brightblade Stout. This is a hand that is very borderline, and of course more borderline than the last hand we looked at, and my instinct isn't to go, oh, throw it back, this could really go poorly for me. Instead I go, okay, how many draws in my deck, and how likely is it that those draws, are close to the top, I just have a lot of them, that will make this hand keepable, functional, acceptable. And well, of course, the obvious one here is Swamp. If you can draw Swamp in this hand, like I mentioned before, his hand's gonna be great. So to figure out that math, we've got a very handy dandy tool called the Hypergeometric Calculator. And I'm sure a lot of people out there have used this before. I've heard me talk about it before. I've heard other people talk about this before. but you can just Google it, hypergeometric calculator. There's a bunch of them. Any of them are going to work. And this is a tool that gives you the percentage that you're going to hit what you need to hit in the time that you have to hit it. For those just listening along, I might suggest just pulling up on your phone or on your computer, just a little hypergeometric calculator tab to follow along. But for those who are watching, you can see there's a bunch of boxes and a bunch of listings beside the boxes that tell you what to put in the boxes. So our first box here is population size. And your population size is your deck. And generally, your population size is going to be like, 33 because you've drawn 7 cards for your opening hand. So we're going to put 33. The second box here is number of successes in the population. And this is how many things that are, whatever you need to find, how many of those do you have left in your deck? So for our example with the black-white hand, we've got, let's just say 9 swamps in the deck still. Sample size is the next box here. And this is basically how many cards you're going to see before it becomes a real problem for you. So I was mentioning, the 2 mystery cards. I would say it's about 2 or 3, but in that hand that we just looked at, because you already have a 2-drop, I'm going to say 3, because you can play the Stoat on turn 2. You get 1 more draw step to draw that swamp. So let's just say your sample size is 3. And in the last box here, number of successes in the sample. What that means is how many of those things, swamps in this case, do you need to find for you to be happy with it? And we just need to find 1 swamp. We don't need multiple swamps. Of course, if we had a Consume by Greed, a 1 black spell, we need to find 2, but we're just going to put in 1 here. And then you press calculate. It gives you actually a bunch of numbers where P, which is your result, is equal to 1, which is you get exactly 1 swamp, is less than 1, is less than or equal to 1, like all these outputs. So you can read it. Anybody who knows pretty basic math will be able to read this chart. But this is exactly how I decide. So it says here that the probability of X is greater than or equal to 1, which is basically my success, is 62%. That's not great, but I would say with that hand, because you have the Stoat in it, and that's going to buy you maybe a turn or 2, maybe allows you to miss 1 more turn because that holds back some early defense or some early aggression. Maybe you maybe want to cheat a little bit and say your sample size is 4 because maybe you can feel like you draw 4 cards before you really run into a problem and don't draw that swamp. I would say that is pretty close to a keep. Now, I could definitely see some arguments where people would want to mulligan that hand. I actually think I wouldn't bat an eye if somebody did. It's a very, very close hand. But that just shows you that if we did have that hand with 1 save or 1 more white card, and again, we have, we can play the Stoat, we can play the Essence Channeler, we have maybe till turn 4 to need to draw the swamp, and again, there are acceptable draws in between there to help keep us alive because we could draw another white 2-drop, we could draw Plains, which isn't that bad. I think that leads me to say, yeah, that hand is keepable. And something that I mentioned a second ago, but I just want to be clear on, is I do think it's okay to consider missing a turn, missing a beat, not hitting that thing for 1 additional turn, and then on turn 4, you hit that swamp for the, casting your fel. So basically the idea here is that, yes, I would love to be able to go Stoat and then have a swamp on the next turn to be able to cast one of these black cards, because your opponents aren't going to have perfect hands either. I think it is very easy to imagine your opponent just curving out all the time, and especially when you're playing best of 3 or in paper where there's no hand smoother. Your opponents just aren't going to have perfect hands. So I would allow myself a little bit of grace. Like if you think it's the slimmest of slimmest margins, such a tough decision, is this a keep, is this a mulligan? That could be a tiebreaker. That you just say to yourself, you know what, it's okay if I do miss for 1 turn. Can't miss for 2 turns. That's going to be really, really bad. But if I draw, another white card, if I draw that swamp and I miss for 1 turn, then I'm able to start casting my cards. That's usually going to be pretty okay. So probably a lot of information if you're not used to hypergeometric calculators, but it doesn't take too much. I think it's actually pretty intuitive once you start putting in the numbers. So next time you have a hand that you're like, I don't know if I should keep this hand. It's missing a little something. What are the odds I draw that thing? Pull up that calculator. I think it really does help. And again, the point I really want to impress here is you're not just looking at your top 7 or the 7 that you're given. You're looking at 7 plus however many cards you will see you will draw before it really becomes a problem that you don't have something in your hand that you really need. And if you're enjoying the show, please do check out the Patreon, patreon.com/limitedlevelups, if you would like to support the show, if you'd like to see it keep going, if maybe you feel like you want to give back after you learn something, maybe won a few more drafts. There's also a bunch of reward tiers over there that we want to give back to you if you choose to support us, that do all focus on getting you better at Limited in some way, whether that be the coaching tier at the highest tier, or getting access to deck tech and draft log review help for myself and other members of the Limited Level Ups community, do check that out. Also, the Limited Level Ups Discord, bit.ly/join the Discord. Discord spelled with a CH like Cordo calls. Go check that out. That's a free Discord. Anybody can join. Bunch of great conversation that goes on over there. So go check that out. Thank you so much. Patreon.com/limitedlevelups. And then the next thing I think you want to consider when figuring out should I keep this hand is, are you on the play or are you on the draw? Because there are hands that I would keep on the play, but not on the draw, and vice versa. And I think one of the main things to consider is what your deficit is when you're on the play or if you're on the draw. If you're on the play, your deficit is you're going to be down a card, right? Your opponent's going to start with 8 cards. You're going to start with 7 cards. If you're on the draw, you're going to be down mana or tempo because your opponent gets to play their land first. You have to, you're playing your land second. You're always a step behind them on the curve. So what that means is when I'm on the play, I'm a little bit less likely to mulligan than if I'm on the draw. Because if I'm on the draw, my opponent's going to have 7 cards. I mulligan, I'm going to have 7 cards. If I'm on the play, I mulligan to 6 and the opponent has 8 cards to work with. And especially because I have mulliganed, it's not that likely I can just kill them very quickly where the 8 cards won't matter because I'm just going to have fewer resources to work with. I'm just less likely to mulligan a hand on the play, generally. This is especially true because on the draw, when you have a hand that is missing a little something like we talked about a few minutes ago, like you're missing a certain color of mana, I'm that much more likely to keep because, again, you have that one more look at an additional card. You get one more. You get to put you get to set that number on the hypergeometric calculator to sample size of 4 instead of sample size of 3, like we looked at on our hypergeometric calculator example. Hands I'm not going to want to keep on the draw, referencing again that you're going to be behind on mana. Your opponent gets to play their 2-drop first, play their 3-drop first. I'm not going to want to keep hands that don't have anything to do before turn 3 or turn 4. I mean, turn 3 depends what your hand looks like. If you've got a really, really great 3-drop into 4-drop, I can stomach not playing a 2-drop on the draw. But especially if you don't have anything to do before turn 4, that definitely pushes me to mulligan. So I have a good example hand here that I would keep on the play, but I don't think I would keep on the draw. So this is out of a blue-green frog deck. We've got a Dream Dew Entrancer, the 2 green-blue Simic rare that has reach, and when it enters, it taps something down, puts stun counters on it. If that thing is yours, you get to draw some cards. Great card. You've got 2 Tree Guard duos, you've got a Mind Spiral, and you've got 2 islands and a forest. So on the play, it's still not a fantastic hand. You would like to play something before turn 4. But the fact that the Dream Dew Entrancer catches you up, that's a big deal, right? Having something that can stabilize you. And I would imagine that there's a good chance that if this is my deck and I've built it with enough 2s and 3s, there's a good chance I draw 2 or 3 before turn 4. So I think there's enough going for this hand on the play, basically. But on the draw, I think with this hand, even though there might be a decent chance of hitting a 2-drop or a 3-drop, but if you don't, it's catastrophic. If you do, you have a good chance of having a leg in the game. But it's really, really bad at this hand if your first play of the game is the Entrancer when your opponent's on the play. Okay, next let's talk about those things that will vote towards me keeping a slightly sketchy hand versus things that make me kind of want to mulligan a slightly sketchy hand. Basically, you're right on that line, things that push you one way or the other. So things that push me towards keeping a somewhat sketchy hand are card selection. If you've got a carrot cake in your opening hand, anything that scries, anything that sees extra cards, that hugely pushes me to keeping the hand because you get to set up even just like 1 scry is going to be a big deal. Something like cash grab, right? So you can set up your lands, find your lands if you need them, find spells if you need them. These kind of cards very, very much push me towards keeping my hand if I'm like kind of iffy about the hand. Cheap removal. This is a big one too. If you have a save or if you have a take out the trash, like a 2-mana removal spell goes a long way in solving some of the problems that a slow hand is going to have. Basically, if I have a hand with both of my colors and one of these 2-mana removal spells, it would be pretty difficult to come up with a combination of other cards in my hand, the other 4 cards, that I wouldn't keep the hand. I think that even applies to Carrot Cake and Cash Grab. Like if you said, I have Carrot Cake, a forest, plains, or Cash Grab and a forest and a plains, and a random mystery 4 other cards in hand, I would imagine that the majority of hands with those 3 things, 2 lands and a Carrot Cake or Cash Grab or a cheap removal spell, those are just going to be keeps. Another thing that really pushes me towards keeping my hand is if my more expensive cards catch me up. So I mentioned the Dream Dew Entrancer a few minutes ago, and this is a card that does stabilize you when it comes down, but anything that gains you life when it comes down, Beza, the mythic, the white mythic, that makes tokens, gains life, and gives you treasure, whatever your deficit is. Like, that is the perfect example of a card where it's like, yeah, you know, I can kind of keep a little bit of a sketchier hand because this card's going to do real wonders for me in terms of catching up and stabilizing. So anything that gains life, anything that comes in and kills something, anything that makes tokens, those kind of stabilizing cards, those will push me to keep a kind of more sketchy hand as well. Because if I do stumble, I know I can catch up in some way. And then a big one is just risk versus reward, right? It's a bit broad to frame it this way, but how good is the hand if you draw the things you need? You know, do you have your great rares? Do you have 2 good rares? If you do, yeah, that definitely pushes me towards keeping a hand that doesn't have it all, isn't just a perfect hand. But if the upside for keeping your kind of sketchy hand is, well, I get to cast, you know, a pretty good uncommon, and like I have some commons that would be fine to play, then I might just mulligan to 6 because the upside in the hand just isn't there. On the flip side, the things that push me to mulligan a little bit more or vote against keeping a borderline hand are, number 1, your deck is just great. This is actually probably the number 1 thing that influences me to mulligan more than I normally do when my deck is fantastic. If my deck is really strong, usually going to 6 cards isn't that big of a deal because the power level of my deck and just each individual card being very good, ideally, will mean that going down a card matters less. And this is the constructed philosophy, right? Constructed cards are just very powerful. You often in a lot of games constructed don't use all, you know, 7 cards in your opening hand. You're much more focused on just being able to cast your cards. So if your deck is great, like you've got an 8, 9, 10 out of 10 deck, then yeah, I'm just a little more likely to mulligan the borderline hands. Maybe you do draw the worst 5 cards in your deck or the worst 4 spells in your deck in your opening hand. You're like, yeah, my deck is capable of producing better hands than this. I think my average 6 card hand is actually better. And that's something that's rare, right? It's not going to be an every deck kind of thing. I would say maybe the top 10% of decks get to kind of have that constructed mindset when they're mulliganing because they are so strong. It's not something you encounter very often. Another thing is that if you're playing an aggressive deck, if you're playing an aggro deck, you just got to mulligan if you don't have 1 or 2 in the vast majority of cases. And I would really make sure if you're keeping that in mind, ask yourself, am I an aggro deck or like just kind of an assertive mid-range deck? Because in an assertive mid-range deck, you know, you can get away with not playing a 2. I wouldn't recommend just auto mulliganing because you don't have a 2 in an aggressive leaning mid-range deck. But if you are truly aggro, like red-white aggro, I need to get on board, I need to get under the opponent, I'm not going to win if this game goes long, then yeah, you just have to mulligan if you don't have a 1, don't have a 2, honestly just don't have a good setup in general, because your aggro decks, since they're only looking to play 6 5-turn games, your opening hand matters so much more than it does to any other deck, because you know, your opening hand is going to be 50% of the cards you see, whereas if you're playing a slower deck, your opening hand might be like a quarter of the cards you see over the course of a game. I was talking a few weeks ago about blue-red in Bloomburrow and drafting the spells deck and how DeFore has been really tearing it up with blue-red. And one of the things that he was saying about blue-red is one of the biggest mistakes people make when playing that deck is just not mulliganing enough. You need to mulligan in your blue-red decks to have a cheap threat in hand, or else all your cantrips don't do anything. It's very much the same concept when you're just thinking of like a red-white aggro deck that just needs to have that creature on board, multiple creatures on board, so their combat tricks do something, so that the removal spells you're casting aren't just prolonging the game, right? When you've got pressure, your removal spells, they're going to start ending the game, because, you know, kill your thing, attack, kill your thing, attack. But when you don't have pressure, when you don't have a 2-drop, your removal spells that would be good in an opening hand otherwise, like I was saying before, cheap removal spells go a long way to make me want to keep a hand. But if I'm playing aggro deck, that's not the case, because I'm just going to go, okay, kill your stuff, kill your stuff, kill your stuff. Oops, now I draw all my 1s and 2s, and they don't really do that much because you're playing 5 mana cards. And this goes back to deck building in a lot of ways, right? If you only got 5 2-drops in your aggro deck, well, you're going to have non-functional hands a lot of the time because you're just not going to have a cheap play. You really want to draft in a way, no matter what deck you're drafting, you want to draft in a way that your average 7-card opener will give you what you want in your early game. And this is why, once again, cheap cards are so important, because you just have to have cheap cards in your opening hand. That's just a fact of limited magic at this point. A few more things before we pack up here. So one thing that we haven't talked about yet is after you do mulligan, what are you going to put back? And it's, of course, going to be a case-by-case basis. I can't tell you exactly what to put back in every single hand, but I do want to kind of tread upon a common mistake that I see people make, and that's always defaulting to putting back the most expensive card or an expensive card in their hand. Because after you've mulliganed, after you've gone to 6 cards, My philosophy is that you want all of your cards to pull a little bit more weight, where you need impactful cards to make up for the fact that you were down an actual piece of physical cardboard. So I've got a hand here that's got 2 Baker's Bane duos, a Sticky Tongue Sentinel, and 2 Tree Guard duos. And I think a lot of people would default just to putting back the Tree Guard duo, an expensive card. Oh, sorry. Also, you have 2 forests in this hand, I should say. So you have the choice of, okay, what do I put back here? Well, you're not going to put back a land, of course. You've only got 2 lands. So you can either put back the Baker's Bane duo or put back the Tree Guard duo. I would be putting back one of the Baker's Bane duos here because you've already got a 2-drop, the other Baker's Bane duo. You've got a 3-drop to play in the Sticky Tongue Sentinel. And sure, you could argue that you might miss your 4th land drop in this hand, and then, oh, you'd like to play the Baker's Bane duo. But that Baker's Bane duo is not going to do that much at that point anyways, right? You're playing a 2-drop on turn 4. Okay, it's castable, but it's actually going to push you towards winning the game. I don't think so. Instead, I think the better thing to do is keep the most impactful cards. So when you do draw 2 additional lands, or, you know, maybe even if you have to wait a turn to draw that 4th land, you draw another 2-drop in the meantime. You can then go Tree Guard duo into Tree Guard duo, and that's really impactful. And this isn't broad advice to every single hand, certainly. There are expensive cards that I will put back. Like, if you put, instead of a Tree Guard duo, you put the Moose, the 6-drop Flash Moose. Yeah, I'm putting that back. I have 2 lands in hand. I'm not close to casting that card. That's going to be rotting my hand forever. But when it's like a 4-mana card, or even sometimes a 5-mana card, don't just auto-put that back. And that's something I see people doing a lot. Another thing you want to consider is just keeping cards that help you go back up a card. So if you have card draw, a Pearl of Wisdom, for example, like that's a card I'm definitely going to want to keep in a hand that I've mulliganed, just so I can keep card parity with the opponent. Sometimes you want to put back a land too, right? Like let's say you have a hand of 2 2-drops, a 3, a 4, and 3 lands. And, you know, it's very tempting and kind of clear and intuitive to be like, okay, I've got 3 lands, and that will help me cast my 3-drop. I draw 1 more land, I can cast my 4-drop. But again, when you want to really keep impactful cards, if you keep too many lands and you draw 3 lands in a row, then, you know, that 5th land is just going to do nothing at all. And, of course, the contents of your deck matters. If you've got a lot of expensive cards, you probably want to keep a land. But if your deck is relatively cheap, and, again, you're kind of okay missing on a land for 1 turn, like, if you go duo into no land, play another Baker's Bane duo, and then you draw out the land for the Sticky Tongue Sentinel, or whatever 3-drop it is in this other example, that I think is okay, right? You just want to be able to impact the game meaningfully as it goes on, and sometimes that additional land, while it does help casting your opening hand, isn't actually going to help you that much long term. But that's a case-by-case basis thing, right? You really have to ask yourself, is my deck mana hungry, or is it okay operating on just 4 lands, and once I get to 4 lands, I'll kind of be okay? And then the final thing I want to bring up is that if you are playing best of 3, your game 2 and game 3s, you're going to mulligan a whole lot differently, because you know what kind of cards you need to keep, what kind of cards that you need to put back if you are mulliganing. You know what kind of hands are acceptable, right? If you're facing an aggro deck and you don't have a 2-drop, you're like, okay, I should probably mulligan this hand. I can't have my first play of the game be a 3-drop when I'm on the draw here. Or if you are facing a slower deck, a controlling deck, not having a 2-drop might not be the biggest deal in the world. I mean, it's a big deal if you are the deck that really needs the pressure, if you're that aggro deck. But if you're like a mid-rangey frog value deck, not that aggressive, not that controlling, you can totally keep a hand without a 2-drop against a controlling deck. Like, I'm perfectly happy to do that. And just a general comment about game 2s and 3s, like, you can just make such more informed decisions, right? Don't default to your baseline heuristics. You have so much more information to work with after you've played a game 1. That ties into mulligans, that ties into things you want to do in combat, when you should play into tricks, when you should. That ties into your strategy of how you want to play the matchup in general. This is definitely veering into a topic for another time, but really do consider what you saw in your game 1s and what that means for the range of keepable hands. Anyways, thank you so much for watching and listening. Hope you enjoyed this level up. Duskborn, coming very, very soon. We will be doing our set review next week, posting it to the YouTube channel on Monday and Tuesday. Good content coming your way. If you want to see more content, please do hit that like and subscribe button, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.